Hello and welcome to another episode of BAC Channel with Mahesh Daas. In this episode, I've had the pleasure of talking with Christopher Charles Benninger, architect, planner, institution builder, thinker, writer, and a person who has had enormous influence and impact on the architecture, urban design, and planning in Indian subcontinent. Christopher Benninger has his roots in Boston. He went to school around here at Harvard and MIT, and he was a tenured assistant professor at Harvard. When a person who is familiar to you and all of us, Balkrishna Doshi, invited him to India to start a new school of planning, an opportunity that Benninger has embraced enthusiastically. And so in 1970, he went to India and never looked back. And his journey in India is not just a story of interest to those in that region, but I think it is a story about values, principles, the craft, and most importantly, service to the society that will be of interest to every community and every society and every region in the world. So please join me to listen to and experience and enjoy this conversation about wide-ranging things, a free-flowing conversation about his life, career, work, and views about great many things. Thank you for reaching out to me and reaching out through my guru, Professor Ravi Anand at Jawaharlal Nehru Technological University in Hyderabad. Maybe I can talk about really how I first have heard of you and gotten to know your work.
Okay.
And it was when I was a student in the undergraduate program in Hyderabad that I was assisting Murali Parnandi, and he knows you, and you met him once, I believe. And so he was doing a thesis on the SOS villages.
Okay.
And so I tagged along. It was actually a tradition in those days that the underclass people will assist the upper class people.
Yes, it was a slavery system.
Yeah, it was. It was a system.
But it was very good because the younger people learned from the seniors.
No, absolutely, and I appreciate it. So at that time, I was spending a lot of time in New Delhi because my own thesis ideas were brewing around Lutyens Delhi and the LIC building, Palika Bazaar, and that whole area, the urban design proposal. So I just tagged along with him. And I went to SOS Village Bhavna.
Okay.
And that was my first experience of your work.
Yeah.
And it was quite inspirational.
Here it is on the cover.
Yeah.
On the cover of this book.
On the cover itself.
Yeah.
There we go.
Because it's one of my favorite projects. It's a 1973 project. It's a very old project.
So yeah, no wonder. If it is on the cover, that is obviously very dear to you.
Yeah.
And very special.
Because it's kind of a classic plan.
Yeah.
It's a system of courtyards, from a very large central courtyard to neighborhood courtyards to house courtyards, which all in village style come together, making smaller communities part of bigger communities and then the large community.
Yeah.
So I've always loved this project, even though it was one of my first.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was a special experience for me. I must say that not only the program of that place was new to me at the time, that this particular place housed orphan children, and then working with foster children systems all across. And then to go to an extraordinarily inspiring environment was quite an eye-opener. But also that architecture in service. That was, I think, one realization that occurred to me.
Yes, that architects have a social role, that architects aren't there to create pretty things, jewelry, up for the rich or for even the middle class, but we're really there to solve some social problems, or at least participate in solving those problems as a partner with Jay and Call, who was the head of SOS Children's Village at that time. And I think that this was a wonderful project. We did another one in Calcutta, which was also very interesting. And I think for me it was a lifetime chance to get involved with a group of people who were deeply involved in social work, particularly of orphaned children.
Yeah, Christopher, I think the more I got to know about your work as a student, because Professor Ravi Anand, who is obviously a long-time collaborator with you, and he used to share stories about his work working on large-scale planning projects in Sri Lanka, and then later on in Bhutan. And clearly your work is, I would say, far-reaching in its scope, variety, and scale, right? From very small buildings to large institutional complexes to city plans, all across the subcontinent, right? I mean, perhaps even beyond the subcontinent. So I think that was clearly, I was watching it from a distance, and I must say that Doshi, who you consider guru, and I told him that I'm your Ekalavya Sishya. In that sense, there is a connection there as well. But I think there are a number of things that connect. And I'm so glad that you could visit the Boston Architectural College.
Well, it's an honor to be here. This is a very famous place for me because I studied at Harvard and MIT, and I didn't have a chance to study here. I wish I had. I think this has been a college which is less theoretical, feet on its ground, head on its shoulders. Really what we should be doing in teaching architecture. I think it teaches people to be practitioners, just like medical schools teach doctors that they can actually do operations and they can actually work with patients. I think this is the more realistic, practical school in the state here, and I think it's wonderful that you're doing this.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there are many parallels, Christopher, I thought, to what you have done when you started the School of Planning at Center for Environmental Planning and Technology in Ahmedabad, and then with CDSA, the Center for Development Studies and Activities in Pune, both of which I know pedagogically were based on what we do here at the BAC, which is to be immersed in the communities and immersed in practices and be able to work with people on the ground and to really bring this enormous body of knowledge in the disciplines to service.
Okay, very good.
And to really engage in a very humble, service-oriented way, and yet also with enormous impact that you have done as well. So I think we are very proud of that. And this being a 132-year-old institution, older than Harvard GSD. And so this has existed for a long time in Boston.
That means you're even older than the MIT school.
Just younger, I think, just a bit younger.
Which year was this started?
1889.
Okay, yes, that was 1875,
Yeah, so just a bit. And I think the relationship between Harvard, MIT, and BAC was very long-standing. People were teaching at all three institutions, and they were very integrated with three distinctive missions. I think that's what worked in that complementary system. So I'm glad that you are aware of it from your student days here as well.
So actually, getting back to your guru, Ravi Anand, his first job was when he graduated from IIT Kharagpur as a planner. He came and worked with me in Sri Lanka. And he was a real leader in the team, even though he was very young. The whole team was young. But what happened was it wasn't just that we were doing 6 plans for 6 cities. All of those cities were capitals of what we would call in America states. They're called providences there. And it wasn't just a plan of a city, because we actually were doing 6 cities. And it was part of an attempt of the central government to bind Sri Lanka together, which is, people who know Sri Lanka know of especially what happened afterwards, that there's a lot of divisions in communities and religions, etc. And that was kind of the golden year of Sri Lanka, when we were doing a plan for the Jaffna Peninsula, Jaffna City, and in the south we did 2 or 3 cities along the southern coast, and then inland we did Ratnapur. So on the grand scale, it was an idea to bring a country together, make people aware of their governance, their civil responsibilities through government. So we were doing these provincial capitals. Yeah. And then they had never done plans before in Sri Lanka. So even today, if I go to Sri Lanka, they tell me, well, these plans are the model. How do you do a plan? What do you do first? You look at the existing situation, roads and electric lines and sewage lines, and you do look at all the networks and you look at the land uses and the densities, then you look at the history of the town. So even today when I go to Sri Lanka, people say, well, we're teaching these plans or case studies even in planning schools today.
Yeah.
So that's very nice. Ravi Anand was a star in that, but we also had other very good people there who are now working with the World Bank and with other agencies.
Absolutely, yeah. And he was my guru and the one who had most influence on me and shaped my way of thinking, approaching the built environment with multiple scales in mind and understanding the cities and regions as a larger context. And so that's what inspired me to pursue urban design in my master's later on.
See, there's a concept in India of a gharana.
The gharana.
Which is mainly in musical schools of thought, but it's there in painting and other areas.
Yeah.
Here we talk about a school of thought, but generally it's one generation of people who are a school of thought, maybe Cubism or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think I studied under Jose Luis Sert, who invented in many ways the idea of urban design as an area of study, because he felt at Harvard we had architecture and we had planning, and there was some gap between the two of them, two-dimensional plans and then standalone buildings.
Yeah.
So in 1956 he started the urban design course. So in a way he's my guru, and he was a kind of a partner of at least shared an office with Le Corbusier for some time. They were both very much involved in the International Congress of Modern Architecture, which focused on urban problems. Yeah. And so Doshi was there. I was with Sert. And even at Harvard, we have the Le Corbusier building, the Carpenter Center. So there's actually generations of involvement, of which maybe Ravi is my student in the 3rd year, the 4th, and now you have so many students here, which is a 5th generation of ideas, which I think we've all shared for 60 years, 50 years, like that.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to see those connections that invisibly connected us, and now that you could be here in person to make the connection. We are absolutely honored to have you here and to bring all of those networks, connections, memories, work to bear. So I think, what fascinates me, Christopher, about your work is in 1968 to 70, when you were doing a lot of travels. Right? I mean, you were probably the most avid traveler that I have ever seen.
Especially at that time, yes.
At that time, right? Particularly at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, today it is much easier to travel, but I can only imagine what your passion, how motivated you were and passionate you were to see the world, to experience it. So could you talk a little bit about your travels, really adventures?
They're adventures. And they're travels, they're not tourism.
Yes.
Today people all around me, they're telling that next week I'm going to Rome, I'm going to London, to Japan, but actually they're going on tours which are packaged and everything is planned. They don't even know which hotels they're going to stay in. Back in my time, for example, when I rode a bicycle from Paris to Athens to attend the Delos Symposium, it was all the unknown. Western Europe, of course, was known to Americans because during the war we were together as kind of an alliance against Germany. But then I did ride a bicycle through Germany and then into Yugoslavia, which was a communist country. And I had no visa to enter a communist country. So at that time, fortunately, there was no digital methods for people at the border to check up on you. So if you talked nicely, they let my partner and I, we were on bicycles through. But these kind of experiences, I think, challenged one's wits and opened up curiosity, made one aware of other cultures. And I think it was a big learning device. It was equal to doing a master's degree at MIT or Harvard or the BAC.
Yeah.
And then, of course, my big trip was when I wanted to start the School of Planning. I thought to go there first and talk to Doshi. So in May, June of 1971, I went overland, starting in London, through Europe, Athens, across Turkey, across Iran, Afghanistan, down the Khyber Pass, into Peshawar and Lahore, and then across to Amritsar and on into New Delhi.
Amazing.
And that was an experience of the life. People claim that there were a lot of hippie travelers at that time, but I never saw any. When I traveled, I might have seen Caucasians, one or two people in Afghanistan. Really, there was nobody in Kabul. I didn't see any foreign tourists as such.
Yeah.
So that was very exciting, and I think it was very educational. I think people should travel.
Yeah.
But they should travel into the unknown. They should not take packages. They should just get onto a train and start going someplace.
Yes. I think the notion of travel and adventure seem to inform many things you do.
Yeah.
Like,
I think so. Because I think every design project is like an overland trip from London to Bombay. You start with the unknown, and if you start with the known, it means you're not a good designer. You're picking up something and putting it in the wrong place. You're picking up prototypes which you can study, but you can't pick them up and replicate them, which many people are doing now. With all of the digital imagery, I've seen architects sitting and going through images and trying to think, well, what image should my building have? Even clients are doing that these days, and you have to tell them, listen, this is a process. It's not we're not choosing objects. It's a process, actually. And I think travel teaches you about processes and about problem solving, crisis management, all these things. So I like to draw an analogy between architectural and particularly large urban design projects, which is really where one discovers himself. Just like when you're traveling on a bicycle someplace, you're actually learning about yourself, your own endurance, your own ability to solve problems, your lack of being scared, having courage to go forward. So I think every design problem, especially large ones, which go on for years. We've been working on the Azim Primji University since 2010, and we're just tendering the second phase of that university this month. So I think it's a long process, everything we do, and when we start, we should start with a very open mind. We should always say that everything starts with nothing. And I think that's a nice way to look at things. It's
fascinating because I think these are all journeys, right? Small journeys, long journeys, and looking at the world, architecture, and the cities through those lenses as well, which I see in your work quite strikingly. Because whether we look at your architectural work or planning work, your teaching work, your institution building work, right? You have, and your writings. I mean, this is obviously a best-selling book and a wonderful read. Clearly, you have many gifts, and all of those, that variety seems to be reflected in everything you do.
But you know, there's a problem with that. It can become chaotic. Right now I'm trying to write 2 different books at one time. One started first, and then an opportunity to write a chapter. Another book came, and that led to doing a whole large book on the history of architecture in India. So there's a kind of chaos in all this that I should actually just finish one of the books and then do the other. At the same time, I'm doing work in the studio. At the same time, we have to visit our clients and we do travel around India giving lectures and attending seminars. I got my grounding in teaching actually, maybe I was 24, 25 years old, at what was then called the School of Architecture, Ahmedabad. That's what it was called. And we started doing that, and then I realized that why don't we also have a school of planning, and not a school of city planning, but a school of urban and regional planning, village planning, etc. So I wrote a note, and Doshi and I talked about it, and then I knew people in the Ford Foundation in Delhi. So I gave Preston Andrade in the Ford Foundation a copy. He liked it, and then my Fulbright fellowship was getting over, and I got a telegram from Harvard saying, you're hired for a post over here. And so I went back. I became a tenured assistant professor at Harvard in due course. And then suddenly, Doshi came visiting, and he said, we've got the permission from government of Gujarat, government of India. The Ford Foundation wants to give us money, but we don't have anyone with a degree in planning.
Yeah.
We have one or two people who did urban design at St. Louis. We have the chief town planner of Gujarat. These people don't want to leave their post and come. So, and he said, I know you wouldn't come because you're an assistant professor, you're at MIT pursuing some studies there. So I said, well, I could be interested, but I'm not sure. And at the same time he came, somebody from the Ford Foundation came through, and I had a brief chat and made a joke. I said, if there's any opportunities in the promised land, meaning India, please let me know. And he said, well, come back and sit down. I was leaving when I said that. He said, would you really give up your teaching job at Harvard and your work at MIT? I was working on a PhD. I had finished all my coursework, passed my theory exam, passed my practicals. I only had to do the specialization exam, the easiest one. Your guide gave it to you. So it was in his interest that you pass it and write my thesis. So I said, well, I can encash my coursework here, get a master's, and it just struck me to go back. And then I talked to Jacqueline Tyrwhitt, who was my teacher, and Joseph Zaleski, a few of my teachers. They said, let's go have lunch at the faculty club. And they said, get out of here while you can. Joseph said,
get out of Harvard while you can.
Yeah, I was at Harvard now. And Joseph said, I've been teaching here 30 years. Look at the faculty club, same furniture. Everybody's wearing a bow tie and a tie. Everything's the same. Nothing has changed. He said, you're too young to stay here and for the rest of your life.
So really, I think it appears you have always been excited and inspired to start something almost from scratch.
Yes.
And create them, build institutions, build pedagogies and curricula and practices and so on and so forth.
That's the fun of it all.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've done the same thing. I think we all do that. Maybe I was younger, and in a way it was kind of a golden age. Because you see, when I came to India, it was a socialist state.
Yeah.
Banks had just been nationalized in 1968. Privy purses taken away from the princes, and the airline was nationalized. Textile mills were being nationalized. So we were going through a period of a socialist country.
Yes.
And I was doing projects like the SOS Children's Village in Delhi.
Yeah.
Mrs. Gandhi was the patron of that project, and she wanted work to be done like that for people. It wasn't socialism out of ideology, like Russia or other countries. It was socialism out of a compassion to really help the people of India. So I think it's often misread by people now that they think the early Congress period and Mrs. Gandhi, that they were just rabid Marxist or something following an ideology. No, I think that they really wanted to change India for the better. And they did many things, like started the Indian Institutes of Technology, the Institutes of Management, a lot of big institution building projects, and a lot of hydro projects and things of that nature to try to take dependency away of foreign countries, stop importing things and paying through our noses by selling basically agricultural products. So that was a transition period, which then in the 80s, we started a kind of Rajiv Gandhi, I think, realized that we have to do something to be more global. Particularly, he pushed the IT movement. He built the first supercomputer, which was in Pune, because the Americans refused to sell supercomputers to India. So he said, okay, we'll do it ourselves. And that was an exciting time for all of us. And then, of course, when globalization came in the 90s, that's when Ram and I started our practice. And the United World College of India, which was actually one of the first, it was probably the first global teaching college in India. Students from 60 countries coming there. And there was resistance there, not from socialists, not from people who said this is capitalism, but from people who said it's an infringement on the culture. We shouldn't have foreign students here. So now that's all changed. The political parties who wanted to protect India's culture now welcome. In fact, they're the parties which are embracing foreign investment in India, etc. So our firm really, my practice up until the 90s, early 90s, was all social projects, all social work with volunteer agencies, etc. And it continued being like that. But we got into larger projects with industrialists, like the Bajaj Institute of Technology in Varda. He passed away, unfortunately, 2 months ago. But I did with Rahul. And then with the Zim Primji, I'm doing a very large university, which again is a social cause. It's a social vehicle. The Zim Primji University is to train people to work in primary education in villages. Not even secondary education, because the idea is that if we don't have good primary education, which is universal, forget about secondary education, forget about institutes of technology, sending kids to Harvard and BAC, etc. But we need to build that up.
I think going to, across your career now, nearly 5 decades of your career in India, would you say that what is a proportion of planning work versus architectural design, building design work versus education and institution building? What would be the proportionality of the work, amount of work?
Of my work in this, you see, a lot of it has to do with history. When I came to India, we only had 9 schools of architecture. Today there are 500 now. We have too many today, we had not enough then. So the challenge when I came to India was creating a larger community of people who had knowledge and wisdom. And so the challenge was really institution building. So I think my first years were more focused on that, though I did do 2 or 3 very large, in Hyderabad I did Yusuf Gura, about 2,000 houses for class 4 workers. They were called the unskilled workers of the government. So we built a township there for them, which was a growing house. We gave them a wet core and a room, and then we gave them a rather deep, large plot where they could add more rooms. And what they did, rather, they rented those to their village friends and their relatives, and they became the managers of human habitat instead of the government, which was much more effective. But what I'm trying to say is that basically, in that period, we were doing very social projects. We were doing institution building. Then in the 80s, up until the 80s, if you know the 5-year plans of the government of India, they focused on agriculture, rural development. Suddenly people realized that cities are important in the 80s, and that's when we did a lot of work, starting in 1980, the Sri Lanka plans, the plans for the Mumbai metropolitan region. On and on we did, and we were the only private sector people doing plans. So often when the World Bank would announce, people make proposals, we had other competitors like Tata Consultancy Services, but they didn't have a clue what planning was about. They could put a big team together and they could make a proposal, but they had no track record. They didn't have degrees in planning. And so inevitably, we got pretty much all the planning work in the 1980s. And then by the time, that was of course still part of a kind of a socialist viewpoint that planners could create the future of cities, not new industries and investments. And then by the early 90s, people realized that we're going broke as a country. We need foreign investments now. So things shifted over away from urban planning into very large projects, which have a global nature. Another revolution in India is the automobile. It's a small class of people, but it's a huge number of cars. And people who can afford apartments, they have to have a car. And you have to provide parking. So we have about 16% around these garden parking areas, or rather nice parking areas. But it leaves us with 65% of the land open. And that's what makes the scheme popular. People can walk on a riverfront, they can play golf, they can play cricket, they can just go sit in the garden. There are a couple of swimming pools and clubs. And it's actually a lifestyle.
Yeah.
We used to sell apartments and houses, and now we're selling lifestyles.
Yeah.
So I think this project was the first in Pune, which really looked at people's lifestyles and what do they do on weekends, where do they take their kids. They don't have to go to some other place, they can do it right there.
Yeah.
So these are big changes taking place, and it's fun to be part of it.
Yeah. And I think I'm sorry, to say, you've seen these developments over the last 5 decades, which is really majority of the post-independence India, right? And at any point during this time and process, did things phase you? Did things challenge you?
I would say yes.
Let
me be frank. If you talk to me, I think even 16 years ago, and said, we need to do high rises now, I would have said, come on, why do we want to do that? Let's try to do an urban fabric, which is pedestrian, human scale. Why do we want to do that? But then land prices were going up in India, and something called the regime of land, which impacts on planning in a big way, on urban design, had to be responded to. So you find a guy like me who says, no, don't do high-rise at all. The first one I did was a women's hostel in Pune for the College of Engineering, which I think is a very classic kind of a tower. But it's for a social purpose. It's because we didn't have places for women. Because suddenly, instead of all boys in engineering and architecture, we're getting all girls. No?
Yeah.
So we could respond to their housing needs. And then the tallest building we're doing, which is probably the tallest building in Bangalore right now, is a hostel for kids. It's not a corporate headquarters. Yeah. It's not a 5-star hotel, the tallest hotel in the world kind of a thing. This is a place which creates 2,000 beds and the sanitary facilities and the eating facilities for students from lower middle class and I would say even poor families to come and learn how to be primary school teachers in villages now. And we're going to we're just tendering another one on the same campus, and we're also doing a 40-story faculty housing. Now, when I taught at Harvard, I never imagined I would design a 40-story building of any kind at all. The same thing at MIT. And now, if somebody asks me to do 50 stories, I know the numbers of high-rise buildings, and I know the problems, the fire problems, the vertical travel, and structural problems, wind velocity and gusts and all that. So we kind of, again, we started with the unknown and we became experts in high-rise buildings now. So it's not something that I would peg my life on, that I want to do high-rise, I don't. But we have to really look at projects as urban design. When you do a university of 3 million square feet on 80 acres, it's not an architectural project. It's not one beautiful building sitting to be photographed and put on the cover of a magazine. It's a place for communities. It's a place for people. And they're going to start making changes. And as an architect, and I have the DNA of an architect, I say, well, why the hell are they changing my building or putting a painting on the wall? And then I realize, no, this is like a community. It's like a village or like a town. The people living here are going to do things, and that's what's going to give it its own character, its own life. So I have to pull back from the ego of an architect and become a more humble urban designer.
Well said. Well said. I think just thinking about your experience in India and my experience here in the U.S., that there is something complementary, something mirroring of kind of an experience where we each have come to live in a country where we were not born.
Yes.
And in that sense, I feel perhaps we are kindred spirits.
Yes, right.
In that part of that aspect of the experience, which I enjoy. I think that's what excites me, inspires me. I can look at things with a perspective that is quite energizing for me.
Yes.
And I think because when I came to this country 31 years ago, and I was working on my graduate thesis in urban design on the city of Benares. And that just gave me a very surreal experience.
Right.
Because I was outside of the frameworks, norms, and ethos of India, and I was able to free myself up from
Right.
those and be able to look at those, the artifacts in the city and the phenomenon that is nearly 5,000 years old, and be able to say, I'm not going to look at it in normative ways. And that I would challenge, and I wrote a work of fiction
Okay.
as extension to Kashi Khanda. So I said that's the only way you can describe a phenomenon of that kind, a city of that kind, to talk about its essence, the engine of its longevity,
Right.
the engine of its resilience.
I mean, I think Varanasi is the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. And it's full of artifacts, even artifacts built over other artifacts. I mean, it's underground in layers, and it's on ground along the Ghats and inside. And it's a very exciting place. It's also a challenge because, we're teaching urban design here, and we're telling that you need urban interventions now. But, okay, it used to be to get to the Vishwanath temple, you had to walk through very narrow passages, and people had squatted there. Actually, they had squatted, and even some of the houses on the path up, they actually have temples inside of them, which the people who came in, they ignored the temples and just and they're still there inside their house now.
Yeah.
So a project was given to an Indian architect, a well-known one, Bimal Patel, and so he's redoing that, and he's really made that part of the Ghats as very hygienic, clean, easy to walk through, and people were very critical. How can you touch such an important temple? But now that people see it, they realize it's what had to be done. So I think doing urban design in heritage sites is a very important and interesting issue.
Yeah.
But we're losing a lot of heritage sites because we're not doing urban design.
Yeah.
We're not addressing problems of people who go to such temples need sanitary facilities. Nobody's looking at that. I've lived in Ahmedabad. I know the riverfront project was needed. It was all the sewage of the city was going into that river, which was dry a good 10 months of the year, and you couldn't even go down there. It was so dirty. A lot of hutments would be built along the shore, and then a flood would come in, they would be washed away. And when the riverfront project came, people said, "Oh, but you're destroying self-help housing. You're destroying people's initiatives," which were going to be destroyed within a few years anyway.
Yeah.
And what they don't know is that more money was spent on rehabilitating these people than was spent on the riverfront development project.
Sure.
There was a new township built for them. So, but I think we're just going through a period in India where the gatekeepers,
Yeah.
and a lot of the gatekeepers are NGOs, people whose fathers were the elite of the early independence period, who have very little to do, so they start an NGO, and they're against everything. And our riverfronts, for example, in Pune, we have 5 rivers now, really have been turned into garbage dumps and illegally built on, and you can't walk there, they're too dirty, sewage is going there. And so now there's a move to upgrade the riverfront. Not like Ahmedabad, not by building retaining walls, because you have floods in Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
So many people told me, how could you have walls on a river in an urban design project in Ahmedabad? So I asked them, have you ever been to Paris? They said, yes. Have you ever looked at the river? There's walls on either side. Been to London? What do you see? Walls. Why? Floods. Have you been to Rome? What do you see? Walls. I said, see, Ahmedabad is no different than any of these other big cities now.
Yes.
And that's not decided by the architect. It's decided by hydrologists and people who are experts in flood control, the irrigation department, as it turns out.
I think if I could turn to a different topic, Christopher, in terms of the architectural projects, they are richly varied in their language, in the material palette, geometrical underlying configurations, ordering systems, even the scale and feel of various things. There is a rich variety. And there are underlying themes that one can read, but they are remarkably varied in how they are manifested.
Right.
And you have also employed a variety of structural systems, experimented with them. I know that you are passionate about that aspect too. So how does that correlate with your life experiences? That
See,
kind
I
of
think
an
it's a very
approach?
important question. First of all, people say, why do all your buildings look different than each other? It looks like 20 different architects who designed these. No? So I said, first, let's look at what's the same. I said, you'll find even in our house, India House, we have a central courtyard. We have a public gathering space. No? If you look at Suzlon One Earth, Central Court, gathering space. If you look at the Kaloscar Institute, you look at the Supreme Court of Bhutan, they all have the central court. And I said, number two, no automobiles are allowed inside of the system. So pedestrianism, central court, gathering space, connection with the inside and the outside, human scale. These are the elements, but the components change. And I said, why do components change? Because of something called the culture of construction, which is a term I use. Kenneth Frampton liked it when I used it in New York a couple of years ago. Culture of construction means what are the local materials? No?
Yeah.
In Bhutan, we had stone, and we had blue pine, and we could get some 10 sheets for the roof up from Bihar.
Yeah.
And basically, that's it. We had wood, stone, and this. And so you have materials, local, craftsmen, local, building management techniques, local.
Yeah.
When we built the National Ceremonial Plaza, that was the construction management was done by the head monk of the monastery. Why? Because he said, we've had so many fires in monasteries, and I've been in charge of rebuilding them.
Yeah.
I know all the woodworkers, the masons, the people who paint. They make local paints now. So I said, that's for me. That's the culture of construction in Bhutan.
Yeah.
We're not going to do what we did in Pune, where we built for example, one of the factories is 110 by 110 meters. It's bigger than a football field now. And it's all out of MS steel structure with a fenestration out of aluminum and glass. And basically, there's no other material except some concrete flooring. So Pune is a steel city. We make automobiles. We make railway cars and engines. No? So the culture of construction in Pune can be RCC with concrete block infill for housing. But for industry, it can just be steel, aluminum, glass, no? With a lot of mechanical equipment.
Yeah.
So it's really the context which says the components are different.
Yeah.
But it's my philosophy that says we need to have a link between the inside and outside of a building. We need to have a central gathering space, which is public. And we need to have pedestrians.
Yeah.
And we need to be sustainable. So I think one needs to separate what we see, which is components, and what we do, which are the elements.
I wanted to ask about, now you have, in a way, there are generations of architects, planners, and designers in India,
right,
who have had great influence and impact, and you worked with them, alongside them, or watched them work. Could you talk about, let's say 2, 3, or 4 architects influential, and how that work has informed you?
Sure. First of all, when I came to Ahmedabad, the School of Architecture by Doshi, I think it's his best work. It was completed maybe in 1966, 67. It has a lot of the elements and components that you see in Surt's work.
Yeah.
Exposed concrete, honest expression of materials, human scale, interesting sections, etc. So I think that building is a really good example of how an interesting section can make a building exciting, and how a very simple building palette, well poetically handled. So I think that if you see my early work, Alliance Française, is very much in that language. Keep in mind, IIM was there. I had when I came to Ahmedabad, there was no television.
Yeah.
Telephones didn't work. So you could walk over to the Institute of Management, and Louis Kahn would be sitting there. And you could actually go in, and nobody did that, but I did, and talk to him. And then his chela, his student, Anand Rajay, He was also a great designer. Became a personal friend.
Yeah.
So I had a friendship with these people. I would say my friendship with Louis Kahn was there, but it was through Anand, his chela, his student. So when I came to teach at Harvard, I'd already met Louis Kahn.
Yeah.
And Anand was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. He'd come back from Ahmedabad. So he called me up and said, on a Thursday, why don't you come down, take the train down tomorrow on Friday and spend the weekend. So I came down, we had a dinner on Friday night. On Saturday night, we were up on the roof of this building having wine. It was summertime. And they said, I have a gift for you tomorrow. I said, what is that? He said, Lou, he called it Louis Kahn Lou, has agreed to spend 3-4 hours with us on a Sunday when the office is closed. No? So we went and spent 3 hours with Louis Kahn.
Yeah.
And he loved that, you see. Yeah. Louis Kahn liked to have an audience and to speak. He was actually speaking to himself, but he needed us to be sitting there. And I remember a little joke Louis Kahn played on me. He took a piece of paper, a typing sheet, A4, and wadded it up, put it on the table, and gave me a sheet of paper and a pencil and said, I want to see if you can draw that, all like a brain kind of. I want to see if you can draw that. And then as a good boy, I start outlining the outline and I'm working and working. He says, that's not it. He grabs the paper and he draws 4 lines, an A4 sheet of paper. He said, that's what you should be drawing. It's just draw the sheet of paper, 4 lines now. Right. And what he wanted to tell me was that how we make the simple complex.
Okay.
And sometimes we don't see the essence of things because we want to be very detailed and scientific. But Louis Kahn, I think as a philosopher, influenced me. Doshi influenced me as a person of a great sense of architectural language. Yeah. And particularly his early buildings had language, no? And I think I learned from that. And you can see CERT. Of course, I worked in CERT studio here. Yeah. I worked on the Science Center. Raji was a great thinker about really like Kahn, taking classic buildings like the Baths of Karakala, our Mandu Mughals site in Madhya Pradesh, and learning from the scale and how they handled masses. And again, but they were looking at projects more from a visual viewpoint, not from a social viewpoint.
Right.
I don't think Kahn or Raji ever thought about the social impact of their work. They were thinking of leaving great monuments, like the Parthenon or the Pantheon. Or I think that's what Kahn wanted to do, and he succeeded in doing that.
Sure.
At the same time, making some very important functional spaces. The museums at Yale are fantastic now.
Yeah.
And I love the Richards Medical Center at Penn. So these people influenced me a lot. I had direct contact with them. And a lot of people influenced my life. See, I was very fortunate that I went to this Delos Symposium in, I don't know if you've heard of Doxiades. He invented acoustics. No?
Absolutely.
And he every year would invite about 5 or 6 very famous people.
Yes.
Buckminster Fuller. But everybody else was of the same standing as Buckminster Fuller. Yeah. Arnold Toynbee was the most famous historian. And Margaret Mead invented virtually a modern anthropology. Those kind of people. I was brought by Barbara Ward, who was a famous economist. So I go there, and we go to Samothrace, the famous temple where the winged victory of Samothrace, which is in the Louvre, but it comes from that site. And so Arnold Toynbee, who was probably close to 80, and his wife said, can you walk with us to the top of the hill behind? Because I think there's an old Crusader fort. It's not documented, but I've read about it in some Greek literature that there was such a fort there. And I want to go see if it's there. So we went up there, and sure enough, there was a wall, and he was very excited. And then while he's looking at it, I'm looking to the east towards Turkey, and I see a huge black thunderstorm coming. You know, when there's a storm, the sky turns black. So I said, sir, we have to walk down. The steps have a lot of mud on it. If it starts raining heavily, we'll all get soaked, plus we can slip in the mud. So let's go back. And then he looked at that, and he said, because he had spent a lot of time in Asia, he said, that's not a storm, that's Asia.
Yeah.
So I said, what do you mean? He said, Asia's heat and dust. That's a big dust collection over Turkey. So
Sure.
to me, that was important because I spent my whole life in Asia.
Yeah.
And Arnold Toynbee, this famous historian, actually said that's Asia. And I went to live in the heat and dust, which I love. You know?
Well, it'll be very interesting in your next writings because you're such a wonderful writer. And you're a prolific writer. You've clearly writing that connects to people, of a wide range of people. Students, scholars, public, everyone alike. And I certainly hope you will write about that kind of a longitudinal experience in India and observing that because you have played a crucial, integral role, right, to the planning processes in the country and in the subcontinent.
Right.
It's not just India, but in Bhutan, in Sri Lanka, in other countries, perhaps around there. So there is, I think, a fascinating narrative I'm eager to learn about.
Yeah.
To reflect on that.
I think so.
For the process.
See, I think one important thing, maybe I think, see, we are professionals.
Yeah.
We're not politicians, no? Yeah. And we live in a democracy where people get elected with various ideologies and beliefs. And so many people say, you shouldn't work with government.
Yeah.
Because the government's right-wing now. And then I'll say, look, we're not politicians. We're not standing for election. Many architects don't even vote. So if you're asked by your government to do something, it's not your job to change their policies. It's your job to do as much for your country as you can, your state, your city. No? So we do a lot of work with government. We do work with the Modi government. I was chairman of the committee that built the National War Memorial. And I think it was very important because every country in the world, in Washington Mall, you're full of war memorials now. We had no war memorial. Yeah. There was a British war memorial for the boys who fought in the First World War, a British war in Europe, no? But there was nothing for the guys who died for India. So that was an honor, which I did about 5 years ago. Yeah. I feel proud that I could help build that monument, not as the architect, but as the organizer, head of the jury, and sort of moving people in the right direction and realizing it within, I think, from the competition to finishing the building, it was 3 years, and we finished it just before the COVID. No? Yeah. And recently, the government asked me to be on what they call high-powered committee. Yeah. There was some criticism of the artwork in the new Parliament building, so they created a committee to oversee that. Yeah. So there are 8 of us which are working on with Bimal Patel, who's a dear friend, on the final design of the Parliament House. That's another urban design project, which we won't go into much detail, but we need this project. The problem is people get emotionally attached to and make up stories. They say Bimal Patel is tearing down all the Lutyens building. Well, he's not tearing down any Lutyens building that's all kinds of things they say. There were some terrible buildings built in the 1950s and 60s, which have no sanitary facilities or fire traps. They're small cubicles of built-in masonry, so it's not like partitions that you can move or replace now.
Now we are talking about the Central Vista project in New Delhi.
Yeah, so I feel these kind of projects always will raise a lot of controversy.
Yes.
And it takes people who know what they're doing, who have confidence and courage to pull them through and finish them. Yes. And it doesn't mean that the person is part of that particular party or something like that. Right. And so I think that's an important thing for urban designers, particularly architects. We can work for our cute clients and people who love us, and we can do a standalone building for them. But when you start doing large projects, you're actually dealing in the public realm.
Great.
And
if I could ask some quick questions, say in India, who are some of the emerging leaders in the world of architecture, design, and planning in general that catch your eye?
See, I mean, obviously Bimal Patel is an outstanding case there.
Yes.
And it's not because I know him, and I'm on the board of the CEPT University where he's the president, and I've been involved in that university, as I've said, from 1968. But I think he's doing a lot of the planning work now.
Yes.
And he's doing it daringly, large planning projects. And the other thing I say is it's really the first time that the government didn't go abroad and take Norman Foster or Philip Johnson or Lutyens or some other famous person saying that we Indians can't do our own work. They're actually engaging Indian architects now.
Yeah.
So I think he stands out right now as a
no, absolutely.
case.
I mean, Bimal is, I know him well as well.
There are a whole bunch of younger architects there who are more experimental, who are struggling. A lot of students who have studied here in America, urban design, have come back to Bombay. One of the women who worked with me came to Columbia. She's now working with the governor of Maharashtra on street improvements and things of that nature. So I think people doing urban design projects in India, and it's happening. They're directly approaching politicians, guardian ministers. We have a system of guardian ministers. And they're getting them to do things. I could mention hundreds of names, but I don't want to do that because if I mention one, then what about the other 99?
Right.
But we have really, if when I came to India, we had Kanvendi, we had Doshi, we had Charles Currier, we had Uttam Jain, we had Rajay, we had in Delhi 5 or 6 really good Ramjat Sabiki and some very good architects there. But we might have had about 20 core architects in the country at that time. Now we would have 200.
Yeah.
And many times when I'm giving a talk in Pune, I say, there are as many talented architects sitting here in the audience as we had in the whole of India.
Yeah.
The problem is, one of the problems is we're always looking in the past.
Yeah.
We're talking about buildings done by Doshi in the 60s, about Rajay did in the 70s, and Kanvendi did in the 50s. And I said, when I came to India, that's now 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Was Doshi talking about 1900? Was Kanvendi talking about No. Why are we stuck in the past? We have to look in the future.
Right.
Because the problems of the past were building a new nation, creating imagery of a new nation. The problems now are social problems. They're great social problems now. And these architects didn't give us the solutions to social problems. They gave us solutions to great monuments like Louis Kahn and Le Corbusier. But that's not what we do today.
Yeah,
our job is different. They did their job. That was the job.
Yeah.
And they did it beautifully. Now let's look at our job, which is in the future. It's not 50, 70 years ago.
Yeah, so, absolutely. On that note, Christopher, I must say, it feels like we have barely scratched the surface of things we could talk about. And given the richness of your life and career so far and the experiences and the impact that you have had, the scales at which you have been able to make contributions, and architecturally, urban design, urban planning, and institutions that you have built, all of that is quite an inspiring story. So I'm very grateful that on a very short notice, you were able to come to the Boston Architectural College and sit with me and have this wonderful discussion and share a little bit of
well, this is a great institution. It's an honor to be here. And it's an institution which has been part of my ethos for the last 70 years. And I think it's lovely to be here, lovely to meet you particularly, and to see your lovely campus here. So I think that it's something I enjoyed. And hopefully we can continue some kind of a dialogue.
Absolutely.
From India to Boston.
Absolutely. Well, I certainly look forward to that. And that our community can learn from you in many different ways. Obviously, this has been a quick trip, but perhaps next time we'll be able to engage you in a more integral way with our community. Yeah. And I think this particular episode will also spread greater awareness about you and your work in our community, but well beyond that. So we look forward to carrying on that conversation.
Okay, great. Yeah.
In the future.
Wonderful.
But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay.